You are not alone on the peninsula or the island. The natives, the people of these islands, can rear their heads at any given moment. And with all their power, they will do anything to be rid of you, an outsider. But who or what are they? Why do they look human but act so opposite? Well, dear viewer, that is what we're talking about today. What are the cannibal natives? What causes the extreme mutations we see in some of the island's denizens? How their anatomy and minds work, and why? Starting right off, let's cover the baseline, the first game's natives. On your first night, you likely won't run into them, and if you do, 9 times out of 10, they will usually just run away. But after that, their aggression starts to grow, quickly becoming noticeable and a problem. Them telling you to leave, to run, not by words, but of animalistic primal yells and screams. Their attacks commonly with claws or basic weapons, but not always. Some have clubs, sticks, fire, and even throw dynamite. But interestingly, none of them use armor or clothing, only sometimes wearing basic skirts, necklaces, or the occasional back-mounted search flashlight on patrols, or arms attached to the backs as a display. But overall, for what they lack in intelligence, communication, or tactics, they make up for in mobility, durability, and raw animalistic strength. Able to climb trees, jump from branch to branch, drop down without breaking a singular bone or showing any signs of pain or even the most mild form of discomfort. Easily able to tear apart your flesh with just a few swings of their claws, withstanding blows from weapons that would easily kill the average person, like the modern axe, the ability to run on all fours, pouncing and leaping like chimpanzees or other primates, and sometimes bringing their more twisted brethren, the mutants, alongside them on patrols or attacks. Meanwhile, their counterparts in Sons of the Forest are quite different. They're still unable to speak, but will use clothing, crafted armor, ranged weapons like spears, wrist-mounted claw blades, head-adorned antlers for charging, and even some semblance of battle tactics when they form groups. A notable example of this being the variety of them you can find in patrols or attack groups as the game progresses. They go from being just normal natives and sometimes muddies to bringing brutes and titans with them. Ones that throw spears, the ones that charge at you, the acrobatic assassins, and eventually in the long term, their horrifically mutated allies from the caverns will be assisting them. But another notable difference is their choice of building material for their camps. The first game's natives primarily use natural resources like thatch and wood, while these denizens of the second island, these people in quotation marks, use mainly skin, sticks and body parts, and seem to build more individualized smaller tents and structures over the more larger communal camps from the first game. And lore-wise, both have been inhabiting their respective islands for different periods of time. The first game's natives have been around easily since Latin was a spoken language, and in all honesty, probably long before that too, as there is a drawing of a Virginia you can find in Cave 5, alongside the obelisk drawing, plus the camps and fossilized bodies of the Christian missionaries that came to the island. And not just that, but a Latin paper found in Cave 1 being from the same time period which confirms this. And while the dynamite being down there conflicts with this, dynamite being invented in 1867, it's possible someone else tried to use the camps, which would make sense given that other people have clearly visited the island. Or maybe the cannibals just moved the boxes there, which makes sense considering they can clearly move stuff, evident by the canned juice drinks you can find stored in some of their camps. Or maybe the cannibals could have intentionally put the dynamite down in the caves because it's old dynamite, meaning the nitroglycerin would have leaked out and it has a very high risk of just randomly exploding. But regardless, putting the potential plot hole aside, this interaction probably happened sometime between the founding of Christianity in the 1st century AD and 750 AD. 750 being when Latin pretty much died out, which is agreed by most historians. Which means they probably ran into that exact Virginia in the drawing 1,274 years ago at the latest, and 2024 years ago at the earliest. Actually, slight correction, the game came out in 2014, so subtract 10 years. That would be 1264 years ago, or 2014 years ago. That difference basically means nothing, so whatever, moving on. And when the Latin paper is translated, it references the babies born from the Virginia, the whole translation roughly saying, "Woman, 4 legs, multiplying serious. Excellently moist skin, pale complexion, the deep depressed rim. Some babies died, the uncle characteristics. Meaty infants, dogs. Cross did not help. Traps do not work, and you ask with his own ways out of the mouth. Of the Oelanificus, do not worry." That being the full translated version. But what's interesting here is that it's described as a woman with 4 legs, which is incorrect and possibly a mistranslation. But I have 2 theories as to why they describe it this way. It could be firstly the Virginia raising its front limbs and charging at them, so they misinterpreted these as arms. Or it could be that they only saw half of the creature and some of them didn't actually know that it had 6, it could be that 2 of the legs were just not visible. But regardless, This outright confirms that the island's population has existed long before Sahara ever purchased the island or carried out any experiments, despite the possible mistranslation. Albeit how they were specifically created and when, while not directly told to us, is heavily implied or shown to be the work of the Resurrection Obelisk. This being via the drawing of it, the plot device of Sahara's later experiments creating an Armsy and Virginia, which are enemies we will talk about later, and the final boss's mutations, and potentially the power obelisk if it's even connected to the resurrection one in a meaningful way. Well, in a meaningful way outside of it being capable of causing plane crashes. But in my personal opinion, I think a natural population on the island came across the artifacts and used them very long ago, which is evident by the giant ancient obsidian doors you can find, and this process created the natives and mutants, which Sahara later experiment on. But the other island is a different case altogether, the Solophyte Cube's activation creating the natives a mere 8 months ago, there even being footage of this exact incident happening. The cube also being on a timer and will do this again given time. How this anatomical process works on both islands, how they actually mutate the host, I'm unsure. However, in the case of the second game, it appears the cube's activation broke each person on the island into several aspects of themselves, fragmenting their consciousness, skills and personality, resulting in the many varieties of cannibal and mutant we see on the island. The twins and caterpillar mutants seemingly being a failure in this process, but we will cover them later with the other mutants. Okay, now with their general lore, varieties and differences covered, now I can actually cover the psychology and physiology of these lot and how they're so different from humans and what that actually means for their internal anatomy. Starting this off with the lowest of the cannibals as reference, we have the Muddies. They move on 4 limbs, climb in trees, swing from branches like apes, and seem to have the lowest intelligence of any cannibal, only relying on movement in packs and ambushing prey like a troop of chimps. Even sometimes jumping down from trees to ambush the player, but primarily hiding among grass and reeds. They don't use any weapons or armor, but in the second game are sometimes outfitted with armor, most likely by their handlers who feed them gore and blood from wooden troughs in the camps, highlighting the fact they're pretty much just pets to the average cannibal. But overall, in both games, they're mentally chimpanzees, having the brute strength and mobility to match. And for them to pull these kinds of antics off, climbing, jumping from trees, and swinging from branches, they would essentially need to be built like chimpanzees, having the same extremely dense bones and muscle fibers that give chimps the sheer strength and durability they have. The aforementioned bone density being necessary to not instantly fucking atomize all of their leg bones the moment they land after jumping out of a tree, and the muscle fiber being needed to hit as hard as they do and move the way they can. Another change that would be needed is the relocation of the leg muscles to better match a quadrupedal walking style, but that seems to already be the case given how fast they're able to crawl around and climb. And on a related note, pound for pound, chimpanzees are about 1.5 to 2 times stronger than most humans. And male chimps have more than half of their body mass as muscle, 51.6% on average, ranging from 48.0 to 56.1%, while bone averages about 13% of their body mass. And for reference, the average male adult chimp is 40 to 60 kilos, so a 60 kilogram chimp has around 30.96 kilograms of muscle. And assuming based on averages that the average 80 kilogram working European male can lift around 30 kilograms and has a 40% muscle mass, if we scale a 60 kilogram chimp to the same size and weight, it's gaining 25% more mass, bringing it up to 80 kilograms, so it's gained 20 kilograms in total. 20 is a quarter of 80. So we're going to run those percentages on the 80 kilos of Kong, and we get 41.28 kilograms of muscle and 10.4 kilograms of bone. Together that's 51.68 kilograms of bone and muscle, which are what actually deliver force and movement, and an additional 28.32 kilograms of fat, organs, blood, etc. While a human on the other hand is 14% bone and 40% muscle, which gives us 11.2 kilograms of bone, 32 kilograms of muscle. Putting those together, you get 43.2 kilograms, leaving 36.8 kilograms of fat, blood, organs, etc. If we ignore the fat, blood and organs, we can calculate the whole body percentage of bone and muscle, which gives us 43.2 kilograms out of 80 for a human, and 51.68 kilograms out of 80 for a chimp, which if we turn that into percentages, we get 54% for a human and 64.6% for a chimp. That just being bone and muscle, which means the 80 kilogram chimp has 10.6% more total muscle and bone mass than a human if we ignore organs, blood, fat, skin, etc. So if we consider the chimp strength multiplier of 1.5 to 2 times, and the human who is 80 kilograms being able to lift 30, that means the chimp is easily doing 60 kilograms with the same effort, plus an extra 5.3% as that's half of the 10.6, which is now to account for just muscle. That brings the new total up to 63.18 kilograms, but it's probably more than that. That being if my math is correct. But anyway, that does not apply to just the muddies, that applies to all the cannibals except the mutants, as the normal cannibals and muddies in both games can climb trees. And considering the larger cannibals like the brutes and titans are much girthier too, we're looking at easily 70 to 80 kilograms lifting force or more, casually, albeit they thankfully can't climb trees. Said strength also certainly explaining how the brutes can swing around whole fucking motorboat engines so easily. But still, that's enough force to send a whole ass man flying, which explains why melee hits from just standard cannibals if you haven't got armor on can do so much damage. Even more so when it's a titan or brute, which getting hit by them actually does send you back a good distance. Which means all the natives on both islands are either literally built like chimps or do nothing but eat protein and lift all day. That first one making the most sense considering the existence of the mutants, but I digress. So in summary, for the cannibals to climb trees, jump from them branch to branch, and even jump down without taking damage, they have to quite literally be built different. Which would also explain how durable they are. That extra dense muscle and bone can take a much harder hit than any normal person and by a good margin. But regardless, now to cover the psychology and culture of the natives on both islands and how they compare. Starting with the first game, if we examine the cannibal villages, as I said before, they use primarily natural resources, wood, sticks, thatch, rope, etc. to create their homes and structures. Only really using human remains as a warning sign or territory marker, but also as food evident from some bodies being hung up in a tree in the middle of one of the main camps. But overall, the best examples of their culture and intelligence are four things. Firstly, their architecture. The triangle huts found across the island, the lookout posts, and the longhouse style builds that can only be found near water sources. Those aforementioned longhouses being the most structurally complex, having multi-parted large supports under them, raising them off the floor, supports inside them, and ramps for entry and presumably sending out fishing boats. Said ramp clearly at one point being a log that was split in half and hollowed out, which would be ridiculously hard to do, albeit not impossible, especially with the bone and stone tools they're likely using. All of this highlighting a great level of planning and awareness. Second being the items and furniture you can find around their camps. Chairs made from slabs of wood that have been carved and slotted together, stools made from cut logs, simple albeit effective tables made from carved wood and logs, animal cages made from sticks and wood probably used to hold rabbits, birds or lizards, the effigies you can find upset around camps to deter rival groups, sleeping mats, and various other props. All of which imply a high level of creativity and problem solving which is near human level. I say near human as quite a few of the builds have obvious weak points or flaws, but have been designed in a way to compensate. The chairs which are slotted together avoid a need for nails, albeit lack an internal cross section for stability. The stools are incredibly simple, short lengths of log that have been cut flat, which are easy to make, albeit they're going to be an inconvenience to move. The tables are simple and made from just logs, which makes them extra sturdy, unlike the models they replaced after an update to the camps, but they would be hard to relocate if necessary. Very well made wooden buckets which would do better with a rope across them for a handle, and those aforementioned sleeping mats don't look too comfortable. Personally, I'd just use a bunch of leather or animal hides instead. But overall, it's pretty fucking impressive they managed to do all of this with probably just bone and stone tools, which further showcases their problem solving capabilities. Thirdly, the tribal battles, primarily between the skinnies, painted cannibals, normal cannibals, and skin mask ones. Why exactly they fight is hard to pin down. Could be over territory, a difference in faiths, or even resources. But they do indeed battle over something that isn't just a mindless bloodlust. They also often don't kill their opponents during fights, instead knocking them down, but if they do die, they will come back to eat them. And fourthly, the cannibals' religious practices and mourning behaviour. If the player is covered in red paint, the cannibals become almost entirely passive, and there is a chance the cannibals will kneel down and pray instead of attacking you. Which outside of this they're rarely observed to do, but when it happens it's at their camps, which implies cultural significance. Some cannibals also have crosses painted across their bodies, which is possibly due to the Christian missionaries that I mentioned much earlier, but we can only really theorise on this. And why they specifically pray to the player in red is not exactly known, but it's implied to be the work of Matthew Cross, probably due to his experiments at Sahara Therapeutics. Matthew Cross himself being a whole can of worms worthy of its own video. But regardless, the cannibal natives will also mourn their dead, females being the most common to do this if you kill a male. Males also sometimes doing this if they manage to escape battle. Both of these show abstract thought and emotion in the natives, the ability to think of and understand something not defined by the literal, and to feel empathy for those they hold dear to them. And with that, in summary, all 4 of these points showcase that while the cannibal natives are not entirely human, also lacking a form of spoken language or written language, they still have a very distinct sense of humanity to them, albeit a far more simplistic and primal form of it, one that does not necessitate words or language to work. If anything, I imagine they convey information visually, probably showing one another how to do something instead of telling them, or at minimum having a rudimentary language based on whatever noises they make. Anyway, regardless, how do they compare to the cannibal natives from Sons of the Forest? Starting with point 1, the sequel's natives have very simple structures, primarily made from skin, sticks, flesh, and not much wood. Logs only really being used for the gore troughs the muddies eat from, their most advanced builds being pretty much just small camps and watchtowers. Moving on to point 2, they have basic stuff like stools, albeit with individual legs, half-cut logs for benches, storage pots made from clay I think for meat, effigies and bones hung up on stuff for decor, albeit that's pretty much it. Point 1 and 2 showcasing a potentially higher intelligence, albeit a noticeable predisposition to cannibalism and violence. Third point, they mostly don't fight among each other, all seeming to be on the same side unless one hits another. The only 2 exceptions to this being the mutants you sometimes find tied up at their camps, which are often puffies, and the masked cannibals, which are actively hostile to the other cannibal groups. Also, when you consider the amount of skin used in their camps, that implies that these conflicts are frequent and brutal. Cannibals on this island likely not sparing a downed opponent. And with the 4th point, cannibals in the second game can also be spotted mourning their dead, which most often happens if the player decides to kill a cannibal in its camp and another one returns to discover them dead, much like the previous game. And cannibals in camps can also be seen preying around effigies, denoting a guttural humming, which shows they too have abstract thought and emotions. And with that, we can summarize that the natives on the second game's island are quite similar to the first game's, albeit far more violent, a lot more intelligent, evident by their much earlier mentioned use of weapons, tactics and armor, but still seem to have a primitive form of humanity, albeit more refined and hostile in nature. But as to what they are on a physical level, I would say, from several observations, they are a form of altered human, not a separate species but a different subtype within the same species. Like how Great Danes and German Shepherds are both in the species Canis lupus familiaris, the domestic dog, and both look super different but can still interbreed. And I point this out because there are 2 things, one in the first and second game, that prove humans and natives fall under the same species. In the first game, one of the Christian missionaries drew a bunch of blueprints you can find, but specifically, if you attain the cross, coffin and church blueprint, the schematic page of all 3 will also contain some rough sketches of what appear to be the following. A pregnant woman with a cross cut into her belly, which implies the missionary, well, I'll let you fill in the rest. Like he did her giggity giggity, who else but Quagmire? With a native woman. The next being severed arms surrounded by crosses, followed by a heart pierced by crosses, the next one being what appears to be a second heart with crosses and upside down feet next to it, and finally the stump of what appears to be one of the sacred trees. And in the second game, if the player maxes out their affinity with the 3-armed, 3-legged woman known as Virginia Puffton, and decides to leave the island with everyone alive, the end of the good ending cutscene shows that she's pregnant, which outright shows that those affected by the obelisks or are mutated can likely still reproduce with humans. And for reproduction to happen in a species, the parents need to have a matching number of chromosomes. Meaning, if the natives on the island in the first game are truly genetically altered, they're most likely expressing ancient human traits rather than having additional genetics added in, like Neanderthal or ape genetics, pushing them back to a more primal form. But as to how the resurrection artifact actually achieves this, I do not know. Plus the artifacts are quite literally alien technology for another dimension anyway, so I'm just going to dismiss them from the analysis as we have no meaningful information on how they even function. But regardless, with that, now we can summarize what the island natives generally are. They seem to be a more primal form of humanity created by the artifacts, specifically by activating ancient genetics allowing them a more ape-like strength, agility and durability, while somewhat retaining their intelligence at the cost of their language capabilities. The degree of ape to human genetics varying from case to case, which creates the muddies, brutes, titans, tribe leaders, etc. But then there's the question of what about the mutants? Well, I'll get to them in a moment, but before I do, I need to say something. Firstly, YouTube notifications for my videos are not the best. YouTube seems to have issues actually sending them out, so I have a Discord for that sort of thing linked in the description. Secondly, I have no idea how long this video has been so far, so if you need anything, pause to go use the bathroom, go get some water, some food, whatever, I'll give you a moment. I'll just wait here. I'll give you 5 seconds to pause. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, there, refreshed, bladder empty, good. Okay, and lastly, uploads from now on are going to be irregular, focusing on quality and what I actually want to make because I've had enough of trying to please the algorithm. And with those covered, now to get into the mutants. Starting with the mutants of the first game's island, we're going to start this one off with the 6-legged Virginia, not to be confused with the woman from the second game, Virginia Puffton. No idea how you'd get those mixed up apart from the names, which actually, you know what, quick mini rant. If somebody watching this is like a writer, make sure you give things distinct names. Don't just be like, oh, they're both females with extra limbs. I'm gonna name them both after the same thing, despite them being distinctly different characters. But in all seriousness, don't do that, it's fucking stupid. But regardless, getting back to the main topic, the Virginia interestingly has a big problem with its lore, because the island's population has clearly been around prior to Sahara setting up on the island, easily around 750 AD or much earlier, as I mentioned before. Established by the aforementioned Latin paper's description of the Virginia, the drawing of the Virginia, and the collectible schematics that can be found, all being from the same group from the same time period, which means it's just not possible for Sahara's recent experiments to be the origin of them. Those aforementioned experiments being seen on the PowerPoint you can find in the Sahara lab, and despite the PowerPoint saying that sibling anomaly may have caused both the Virginia and Armsy to mutate, we get zero context as to what the actual fuck that even means. We know it's definitely not them trying to shove multiple people into the artifact or revive multiple people with it, all at once, because firstly the artifact can only hold a singular person inside, and secondly, machinery connected to the artifact has only 5 tubes and all 5 are needed for a singular person, meaning it's just not possible for multiple people to be revived at once or to be shoved into the machine, so that rules those out. It could be referring to potentially a pair of siblings being used, one going into the machine, the other one going into the artifact. But unfortunately we get zero exposition on this, so this information essentially means nothing. But regardless, another interesting note here, being that the cowman is also completely absent from the slideshow, albeit there's a photo of the cowman seen on the notice boards. But overall we're going to have to completely disregard this presentation as it's pretty unreliable, and the only real way this thing makes sense lore-wise is if they somehow accidentally created a Virginia and Armsy during a test, which would somewhat make sense considering you can find an Armsy still roaming around down in the labs, alongside a dead one in a nearby cell, or Sahara intentionally went out of their way to recreate these mutants as a means to study them, which the notes on the presentation do imply, especially the mention of multiple sex organs, which means they probably had to cut one open. The one they cut open obviously being dead, because there is no fucking way you're getting that kind of information out of a live one without getting ripped to pieces. Said live one probably being something they couldn't even keep in containment for 5 minutes without it smashing through the glass and escaping like the Armsy did. But anyway, in a related point to that, you also cannot find a single Virginia down there. Only 7 mutant babies, that one live Armsy that escaped, 3 skinny mutants and the final boss. So overall, we can't really completely disregard the presentation, but we are going to have to push it aside. Primarily because it conflicts with the origins of the mutants and how long they've been on the island. But what it does show us is something completely different. It shows us that Sahara were actively experimenting with the mutants to figure out what makes them work, regardless of if the creation of those mutants was accidental or intentional. I'm going to lean more into it being accidental, especially with the mutations we see Timmy throughout the game and its sequel go through, and the mutations that happened to Megan Cross, and presumably the other test subjects who were directly plugged into this thing. But we do know that the artifact does not guarantee that the subject turns into a mutant, as you can find the skinny cannibal mutants down there as well, which are pretty much just a stronger version of the cannibals you can find on the surface. But regardless, overall it's too open-ended. It definitely points us in a direction, but it doesn't give us many concrete answers, which is why we're pushing it to the side, because it's really just not going to help. But anyway, moving on from that, anatomy-wise, the Virginia appears to be 3 humans fused together. The arms merged into the body, the face highly distorted, and is weirdly enough the only mutant with genitalia. Like, even the standard cannibals completely lack external genitalia for some reason. They may have something else going on internally, but whatever. Anyway, the caves they live in are filled with their dead spawn, forming large piles, all of which seem to be recent and are even littering the floor, meaning this thing is likely constantly pregnant somehow. And how these creatures even survive down there is unknown, as some caves are completely sealed up with wooden barriers, and they have no mouth to eat with at all, so my best theory is that the vagina below the Virginia is also a mouth and anus, which leads to a simple stomach inside them, similar to how a jellyfish works, and they're fed by the other cannibals. Or the power of the artifacts is somehow keeping the mutants alive, which would very much explain how the mouthless Armsy and the cowman, whose has been completely sealed over by skin, are still alive. But anyway, body-wise, the Virginia probably has a compound hip bone composed of 3 pelvic bones fused together, giving it the rigidity and strength needed to leap like it does. Meanwhile, everything above that in the upper body is probably just an amalgamated compounded mess of disorganized bones. And the Virginia's feet appear to have been completely restructured into solid hooks devoid of any toes, probably being made from a singular solid bone. But the blue variants of the Virginia and Armsy, however, I have zero idea why these exist. They are more powerful, but there is no lore to these creatures. My best guess for them is that they're probably some sort of experiment by Sahara. They've been dyed blue to keep track of them, which would explain the complete lack of a blue cowman. But that's pretty much just a theory and there's no real evidence of that, so I'm just going to be skipping the blue variants entirely. And with that, speaking of the aforementioned Armsy, we'll be moving on to him next. Again, not much to say lore-wise, but anatomy-wise they are very interesting. This towering unit, this wall of flesh. This absolute unit is armed to the teeth, quite literally, if it even has any, and walks on 3.5 legs, the third leg splitting at the knee, forming 2 lower legs, seemingly to provide extra balance support, and the feet have become warped, almost resembling hooves. It also lacks a distinct head, but features an ear just barely visible on top, sunken into the flesh. Inner anatomy-wise, however, the gaping slit in its torso is seemingly an overgrowth of the ribcage, making space for additional scapular bones to act as the muscular foundations for its additional arms. Its body is also quite wide, possibly due to an enlarged spine, which would greatly benefit it given the force of the swings it can put out and the weight of the additional arms. And the top arms have much larger shoulder muscles, which seem to have merged with what was once the neck muscles. The head probably being pulled in and absorbed with this area, which is why an ear can be seen. But as to how the fuck this thing is capable of seeing, I have zero idea, as there is literally no indication of any eyes or sensory organs beyond the ear we can see. And with that, now to go over the biggest boy of them all, the cowman.
Damn, boy, he's sick!
Not too much to say over these guys. They're big, able to run fast, and can smash through shit faster than the Kool-Aid Man. Lore-wise, considering multiple cowmen can be found, I very much doubt Zachary, a youngling who went missing, was turned into one, as I see no real way for so many of these things to be made and then dumped in caves where most often they can be found outside of the late game enemy patrols. In all honesty, they are most likely mutant babies that were left down in some parts of the caves and have continued to feed on whatever scraps were dropped down there as a living garbage disposal, allowing them to metamorphose into Reddit moderators. The many limbs you can find in the Chainsaw Cave being a good example of this, as 2 cowmen reside down there. But anatomy-wise, they would need super strong bones to support their weight and to survive the forces of crashing into things full force. The weight of a cowman probably being around half a ton, if not nearly a whole ton, which necessitates extremely powerful muscle, especially to pull off their charge attack, and even more so to perform the leap and belly flop attack. And in addendum to this, they would need a lot of fat around their brain to protect it from the head-on collisions they're often going to be subjected to. So really, they're pretty much built to be a living Indiana Jones boulder doing their best Nikocado cosplay. And with that summarized, now to talk about the mutant babies. There's not really much to say here. Lore-wise, Sahara was probably using them as test subjects, which is why we find so many of them in incubators in the Sahara labs. They're also unlikely a victim of the resurrection artifact due to the sheer quantity of them we can find. So it's more likely that they are the offspring of the Virginia, as those things can produce them at alarming rates, evident by the giant body piles in their caves. But biology-wise, not much to say here either, as we don't have much info on them. Albeit I do theorize that most of them have internal deformities, which is why so many of them are dead in the Virginia caves. And that's pretty much it for them. And now to go over the last 3 all at once, as these are all connected. The first one of those being the final boss herself, Megan Cross, who was mutated by the artifact after being revived by her father, Matthew Cross. Her original death prior to this revival being at the hands, or more accurately many arms, of the escaped Armsy. Very likely the same Armsy you come across in the Sahara facility. But as to why Megan Cross mutates the way she does, I have no idea. It could very possibly be an incompatibility with the artifact, but mutations do seem to have relations to the Virginia in several aspects, as she can spawn mutant babies during the boss fight. and has grown a number of additional limbs, the 3 long limbs being the primary ones, but she also has a bunch of smaller ones under her used for melee attacks. The 3 long limbs being half of the Virginia's 6, but it is possible that instead of it forming 6 limbs, it just merged the 6 into 3 and made them longer instead. So there is very likely some form of connection, albeit it's not one we can really pin down. Another interesting thing here is that those said mutations will completely fall off after the boss is killed, which implies that they may be a separate entity altogether, which would explain the existence of the second mutant for this section, which is the tripods, which only start to spawn on the island post-game. As to why they do, it's possible that the detached 3 limbs and other parts were still alive and reformed after the fight. This process also creating the third mutant, that being the worm, as a stabilization for all 3 limbs to connect to. Said worm being set free when a tripod enemy is killed, allowing the worm to escape and duplicate if not dealt with quickly. But overall, considering the biology of this, it would require beyond cancerous levels of cell growth for all 3 limbs to rapidly grow as we see them before the fight starts. Not just that, but the sheer level of heat that level of rapid cell division is going to create would most likely burn the mutant from the inside out, killing it very quickly. This same problem also applying to the worm when it divides, more of them just fucking spawn in out of nowhere. Like, they instantly commit full body mitosis, which would realistically immediately cook them or at least set them on fire. And there we go, that covers the mutants of the first game, but oh boy, we are far from done. But before we progress, I'm just gonna say, all the lore I've dropped on Megan Cross is all just surface level stuff. If I ever do a video on Matthew Cross, I'll probably go over the situation that happened with her. She seems to have had some type of terminal illness, what exactly we don't know. We never get told or even hints as to what disease was killing her. But regardless, before we continue with the mutants of the second game, it's been a while, so firstly, if you need another break, pause here. I'll give you 5 seconds to do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, all good? Nice, let's go. Secondly, again, I have a Discord in the description. And thirdly, if you're enjoying this analysis video, please give it a like, subscribe if you want, and when this is over, if you have constructive criticism, please comment below, it's much appreciated. Also, massive thank you to Roanoke Gaming for inspiring me to actually sit down and make a long form video on this game. Go check the dude out if you like stuff like this. But anyway, now to get into the residents of Epstein Island. Starting with Armsy and Virginia, they do come back in the sequel, albeit this is after the ending if the player decides to stay on the island. This plus the fact mutant babies can be found in some caves also raises questions about their presence. Why do you only see Armsy and Virginia after a second cube activation? Why are the babies in groups but no other mutants around them most of the time? Why does the Cowman not return too? All of which go entirely fucking unanswered, but I do have a theory as to why. I personally think the Armsy and Virginia start appearing on the surface because some natives were mutated into them by the second cube activation. Which we know is possible as Virginia Puffton has a third arm and leg due to the first activation, so she is halfway between human and Virginia. And why the babies are left unattended in groups, I have 2 theories. First being the most unlikely, some Virginias may have dropped them out and migrated deep into the caves beyond the player's reach prior to the second activation. Second, and most likely being, some of the natives or mutants got a bit freaky, giggity giggity quagmire style, and then just kind of plopped them out and left them thereafter. Which, very weirdly, they will also start to spawn on the surface too after a while in groups, but as to why, I have no idea, they just straight up manifest out of nowhere. And as to why the Cowman does not appear, it was probably replaced by the big hole-covered things, the Holy. Or there's just not enough food waste to allow them to exist. As you know what, with that, I'm just going to move on to the next mutant, those aforementioned holy creatures. Which gameplay-wise is pretty much just the Cowman, albeit much chunkier. And lore-wise, we're going to skip that because blood just has none, man is bone dry on lore. So we're going to dive straight into its anatomy. This thing would need bones like a fucking elephant to support its weight. Like absolutely zero hollow spaces within its leg bones. All of its bone marrow probably being relocated into the upper body. That aforementioned upper body also clearly once being a torso, as a ribcage can be seen at the front among the many orifices. Said orifices being, honestly, I have straight up no idea, probably mouths and anuses, all leading to some centralized stomach. But overall, it's functionally the same as the Cowman, just with an extra leg and a far more disorganized body, which lacks any obvious sensory organs, so how the hell these things can even see you and know where to attack, I'm gonna be just straight with you, I have zero idea how. Unless they're using like scent or echolocation, but that's pretty much all I can come up with. So moving on to the next mutant, we have the Puffies, which are essentially the same as the natives, albeit they're entirely blind and hunt by sound. They're essentially the same morphology wise, but the fact they're so adapted to hunting entirely by sound implies a form of rapid evolution taking place, possibly caused by the cube artifact's effects. And lore-wise, these monsters split off directly from the two Puffdons, which is why male and female variants exist, and the Puffdons themselves both have turned into stronger variants. But otherwise, that is all there really is to them, apart from the few variants that exist, which honestly seem to be just pigment mutations, despite some of them being stronger than others. Next up, we have a 2-for-1, the Caterpillar and the Twins, both of which seem to be a failure in the division process caused by the cube activation, as a dead caterpillar can be found in the dining hall where the division happened. The caterpillar likely being a puffy or someone else that divided long ways and got stuck, and the twins suffering the same fate, albeit horizontally, which has interestingly impacted their morphology and abilities. In the case of this cat dog looking ass motherfucker we call the caterpillar, this has allowed them to form a singular, long, powerful, muscular body like a snake, which allows them to slinky their way around and swing their whole conjoined body for an attack. And the twins seem to have developed a singular consciousness, as both work as a singular being when moving, the combined grip allowing them to climb walls and ceilings with ease. This combined consciousness being why if you target just one, both take the same amount of damage and can't be separated, meaning both twins likely have one half of the brain dividing the consciousness into both. Also, morphology-wise, both twins have different heads, so it's possible that both serve different sensory roles, like one has giant slits in it to possibly be a giant ear, or the other may just be big sinuses for smelling. Albeit that's just a theory, but it is a possibility. And with those fittingly paired and covered, now to cover the next mutant. Your mom! Just kidding, the Blob. This thing is an absolute anatomical disaster. There is straight up no order to it, and in all honesty, it reminds you of the Blob or Huddle from Inside, which is a game I may talk about one day. And it also reminds you of the big blob from the first game held in one of the Sahara facility chambers. But regardless, it slithers towards you in a single cutscene alongside some mutant babies for some reason, and is never really encountered beyond this, except for having to blow them up as obstacles in caves and the occasional sighting of one that's in areas you can't access. And that's really all there is to them. There's no lore, no explanation, no exposition, nothing, which in all honesty is extremely disappointing. So anyway, on to the next mutant. We have the Demon and Demon Queen, which also have fuck all lore to them beyond possibly being humans at one point. Also, why crosses make them, something that lives in a fucking lava zone, straight up combust? I have no idea. You'd think something that lives around lava and is immune to it would be, immune to fire, but no, they're not for some reason. Like, the Demon Queen's immune to lava. We see that thing come out of lava at the beginning of the boss fight. It's completely immune to it, so I don't know why the smaller ones aren't. But regardless, anatomy-wise, they have thin bodies, rib cages and spines that protrude, pointed feet, eyes to the side which imply they're prey to something, as only really prey animals have eyes like this, and their typical attacks are done by arching their backs and launching their hind legs over their heads to stab the opponents with their hind feet similar to a scorpion, or going wild with a volley of stabs using their front limbs. But are also capable of climbing on walls and ceilings to ambush you. Why the gold armor reduces the damage they do, I have no idea. Could be the magical properties of Solophyte for all we know. But the Demon Queen on the other hand, the boss you fight in the Hell Caves, is pretty much just a regular demon, albeit it's much larger and more agile with a fuckload more health. The only difference between it and the smaller demons being that it has a leap attack. Also weirdly, demons and the demon boss can start to spawn on the surface post-ending for some reason, which makes me think that staying on the island is not supposed to be canon. And everything that happens with it is not canon either, it's just for fun. And with that, we have two more mutants to go over, and then we're done with this section of the video, the Legsy and the Fingers, both of which have little to no lore. Starting with the Fingers, they have no arms or face, just a long row of fingers down its body. Their design could very much be inspired by the Lying Figures from the Silent Hill franchise due to their strong resemblance. It's also worth noting that the Fingers spit a substance from their chest just like the Lying Figures spit acid from theirs. The aforementioned spitting ability seemingly being used to create nests in the caves, marking territory or to store food for eating later, evident by some of the bodies you can find. This ability also weirdly enough not being used for combat, they rely entirely on melee attacks to kill you. Lore-wise, a dead one can be found in the banquet hall where you fight the Puffdons. It can be seen sitting in a chair with the nameplate Hank K's. Anatomy-wise, it seems the arms were entirely absorbed and the hands got stuck in the face when this happened, which was replicated along the body. Said hands are likely also attached to the ribs, and the sternum in the middle is clearly no longer present, probably being absorbed to split the ribcage, creating the mouth. And the stuff it shoots out based on the bubbles seems to be a highly modified form of mucus, one that slowly hardens to secure things in place. And, with all of that pointed out, now to cover the final mutant, the Legsy, which straight up just has no lore at all. so I'll get right into what they do. Much like the Virginia, they can leap into the air to try and land on you, and they will attack by swinging their legs at you, and they also have the ability to charge at you incredibly fast. They're able to also climb on cave ceilings, allowing them to ambush you, and have a ridiculous amount of health, which honestly feels disproportionate to their size. Anatomy wise, no idea how these things can see you, but they do regardless. They scuttle around with a bunch of finger tentacle things, and they sort of remind me of the Virginia possibly being a failed formation of one, which would explain why there's like extra limbs and stuff coming out of it. Those aforementioned finger tentacles at the bottom of it would need to be crazy strong to lift them and keep them on ceilings, maybe having grip pads like a gecko or maybe some form of adhesive. But overall they're a complete anatomical mess and there is really not much to say about them, so that's pretty much it for the legsy. But also we're going to be skipping over the final boss, who I'm going to be honest, I straight up cannot pronounce the name of, as he's not a natural denizen of the island and does not have any real relevance to the video topic. If anything, its character would need its own video to go over, which I'm going to be honest, I'm just probably not going to do, as I straight up do not care for him. And yes, while his mutations are interesting, it's pretty much just an anatomical mess due to him being literally outside the cube when it went off. The man took the full force of the cube at point blank. So whatever. But anyway, now for the final section of the video. The theory section where I talk about what the mutants mean for my verdict on the natives, you know, the whole but who or what are they thing I said at the very start. And yes, I am aware I said they were a more primal form of humanity much earlier, but I'm basically going to explain how the mutants fit into this. So now we need to consider the origins of the mutants. In the first game, the mutants and cannibals have clearly been around pre-750 AD, so some ancient group of humans probably used the artifacts, very likely early Homo sapiens, which created the natives as we see them now, and probably also gave them genetic changes that would allow the mutants to exist. Said changes being very specific mutations to gene expression, which can randomly activate when a cannibal or native baby grows up and hits puberty, its gender, male or female, predispositioning it to becoming either an Armsy or Virginia, or rarely a cowman, which is probably dependent on caloric intake, meaning every time a native has a baby, there's a chance it can randomly grow up to be a mutant instead, which is the best verdict I can come up with because clearly the natives do not have the technology to utilize the artifact. Like, human scientists had to actively create something that could be attached to the artifact for it to be utilized. But anyway, this could also explain why, when Megan Cross is defeated and if you stay on the island, the tripods and worms start spawning. Megan being revived created the new species of mutant by introducing new genetic material to the artifact. By killing her, you have unknowingly set free the limbs, which become a whole new separate thing entirely. Which also explains why we don't see the tripod or worms in the sequel. They are a whole new thing which has been locked to the first game's island. All of this basically means that the cannibals of the first game are indeed a more primal form of humanity, albeit one that has a highly modified form of gene expression that causes some of them to grow into mutants, but they still fall under Homo sapien as they can interbreed with humans. Albeit with the second game, however, the natives are pretty much the same as the first games. They are a form of Homo sapien, but I'll be honest, I am not classing the mutants as the same species. As to why, it's because the gold cube is not the same as the resurrection artifact. It's clearly having a very different impact on the island's population, creating different mutants entirely, which means there's no guarantee they're all able to reproduce, despite the ending with Virginia Puffton. She maybe got lucky considering she only gained a new arm and leg, so really it's no guarantee. Not just that, but I personally do not consider the Armsy and Virginia returning to be canon, as this ending is also implied to not be canon by the stuff shown during the end credits, which tells us that the protagonist writes a book about the game's events, which necessitates he leaves the island among other stuff. Armsy and Virginia probably only returning to spice up the post-ending gameplay. Also, we can confirm it's not the cube deliberately bringing them back, as it does not bring back the cowman or the tripod or worm with them. Mutants that would be far more destructive to an invading outsider than the Virginia and Armsy on their own. So overall, I consider the second game's mutants to be a different group of species entirely. And with that, I'll condense all of this down into my answering statement. The natives of the first game's island are a sub-variety of Homo sapien with a more primal build and altered gene expression, allowing them to sometimes mature into the island's mutants. While the second game's natives are very similar, albeit the mutants are a grouping of subspecies or a different species altogether. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of the denizens of both islands. As I said before, I have a Discord in the description, comment your criticisms below, leave a like and such. My disciples, I'll see you next time, goodbye.